So Samuel and Saul have very similar names, Sul and Shmuel, kind of like we say Joe Schmo. And this actually matters for the way we read Saul's story. Stick around, we will explain. Hello, welcome back to Kairos Conversations. I am Ryan Martin, Kairos Classroom's Greek guy, and I'm joined by Courtney Trotter, our resident Hebrew enthusiast. And no matter your background, whether you know Greek and Hebrew or are just interested in the Old and New Testament, with Kairos Classroom, we will help you discover the world of the Bible through the original languages. And in both Greek and Hebrew, and maybe especially in Hebrew, word plays are a big part of how the language works and how the authors will draw your attention as the reader to specific things in the poetry or in the narrative. And before we jump into Saul and Samuel today, Courtney, can you just talk to us about wordplay in the Hebrew Bible and what we should do with it?
Yeah, like you said, it occurs so often in our Hebrew Bible. And part of that is just a function of the nature of the language, that Hebrew tends to be a very terse, quick language. And because of that, there aren't a ton of vocab words. And even those vocab words are kind of have a limited spelling. So they often sound alike anyways. But these are intentional choices by the authors of the final text to tell us something about the nature of meaning. And we use wordplay all the time in English. This is where we have double entendre or puns or like word mix-ups or smash-ups. And we often see this in like things like plays or TV or even like in albums, or music, that they're telling us how to engage with and interpret what's going on. So anytime you see a wordplay, you need to ask why. There's something happening there, and the person using it is employing and intending to use some kind of special meaning that otherwise they would have chosen different words, right? But they're using these specific words. So especially, like we've talked about this a lot, Ryan, with some of your research, that these texts would have been initially oral texts, somebody reading them out loud and the people receiving them orally. So the way that we imagine watching TV today or watching a play today is how that would have happened in the past. So whenever we watch TV, we have what we call callbacks from like previous episodes or something like that, where the same language is being used. And when that happens, we're supposed to remember kind of both images from the TV show at the same time. Right. And when that happens, we like compare and contrast between those, and we see what the hidden meaning is. And you might not get that on first blush. So you might be asking, like, do these Hebrew readers or listeners of the early text, do they get that at first? And they may not get it at first, but after listening to it like tons of times, like you do with your favorite TV show, every little nuance. You've probably listened to, your favorite podcast talking about all the hidden meanings that the writers intended in the TV show. And so you're able to pick up on these things that you wouldn't have had before.
I mean, maybe picking up in the middle of an extended Hebrew narrative would be like starting in season 3, episode 5 of your favorite TV show. You're not going to catch all the jokes. You're
Yeah.
not going to catch on the what's happening specifically in these character arcs, or this, I don't know, this one consistent faux pas that this character makes that is only funny if you understand what's happened before. Now, I mean, I remember hearing about word plays and some of these literary devices as a young Christian, and it all just kind of seemed like hocus pocus to me, like looking for some kind of magical, weird meaning in the text. And it wasn't until later that I realized, like, no, this is how this kind of storytelling and this genre actually works. That this is an
Mm-hmm.
important part of us understanding what the author actually meant, even at the surface level.
Yeah, it like reminds me so much. Whenever I think about this, I think about like Michael Scott, right? He's one of my favorite characters on television, and he has so many of these what we would call word plays, but because he's a character, we know that these are intentional choices by writers, and they're telling us
Right.
something about who he is every single time he does it. So like, there's that scene where he's evaluating Jim, and it says that he's smug, right? But Michael reads it as smudge, and Jim's like, "I think you mean smug," and he's like, "There you go with your smudgeness." right? There's the wordplay using smug
Yeah.
and then smudge and then smudgeness, all there together. And it sounds alike. They're similar words, but with different meanings, but we're playing on both meanings all at one time. And so that's one example of Michael Scott doing that. Then we have that exchange between him and Jan where he says yeppers and she's like, what did I tell you about yeppers? And he's like, yeesh. Yeesh is a made up word, right? But it sounds a lot like some affirmative yes sound that he's just trying to fill in there. So we see it, like we just notice it and we don't even notice it half the time. But every single time we laugh at it because we realize that it's intentional in some way. And so that happens to be a funny example, but there are ones that are more or less serious. So I've got a slide for us pulled up here from this author. His name is Gary Rensburg. He's got a book called How the Bible is Written, where he goes through a lot of these different types of wordplays, like alliteration and repetition and all these things. And he uses the example of Mercutio from Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare, where he says, ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. And he says, in the senses of both serious and buried, right? Like you won't be able to ask for Mercutio tomorrow because he will be in the grave, right? And specifically what we're going to see today between Samuel and Saul is what's called a tacit name derivation, which is written by Moshe Garciel. He's done a lot of work on the theology of names in the Hebrew Bible. And he says, in these cases, the text does not present alliteration, but rather demands that the reader and listeners apprehend a lexical nexus, which is fancy for just saying a series of different words like smug and smudge, in order to mine the full meaning and thereby enjoy the full pleasure of the text. So this is just an invitation to enjoy the text even more. Like you said, not to look for a hidden meaning, but to just get the full enjoyment of what is meant by the biblical authors.
That makes sense. I mean, I think there's lots of times where we see our students having these big aha moments or being enjoying so much they're being able to read the text in Greek or Hebrew. It comes not from this like, oh wow, there's this event or question that is answered or like theological nuance that I couldn't see in English that now I see in Greek and Hebrew. No, it comes from the fact that knowing the language, you can actually follow the story and see its nuances in the way that the original author intended his audience to hear or see it. Sure, you can read all of the events that are happening in Saul's and Samuel's narratives in English just fine, but you miss what the author is connecting. You miss what the text is privileging and putting X in the context of Y or vice versa. You don't see that when you miss these wordplays. So maybe this is a good time to transition to specifically the names Samuel and Saul, and show us what you just talked about with wordplays. How does this help us read this set of narratives better?
Yeah, so we'll just look at the one right on the surface right there, and we'll compare the names, like the literal names of Samuel and Saul. They kind of sound maybe similar in English, but whenever you look at them in Hebrew, if you're just looking at those letters, you see like the only difference in the letters and the spelling there is the M. Like otherwise, the spelling is exactly the same, and it's almost like we've gone Michael Schmeichel or something like that. We've gone Shaul Shmuel. That's the only difference that we've made here is just adding that M in there. Shaul Shmuel. So they sound so similar. That's that tacit wordplay that we were just talking about there, where it's not actually lexically connected, but they sound like they are. And Samuel's name means he is God, and Saul's name means the one asked for. And what we're going to see here is that little like footnote down at the bottom that like asking or the verb sha'al becomes a major wordplay to connect both characters in this first section of 1 Samuel.
Wow. All right. So again, reading in English, Saul, Samuel, maybe kind of similar, but you wouldn't assume something is going on. But if you know Hebrew, especially if you're hearing this as a Hebrew speaker, this is obvious, and the way that the narrative unfolds, especially with all this asking that's going to be happening, it ties it together. And as we're going to see it puts the Samuel story kind of against the backdrop or in the light of Saul's story. Again, something that might not be obvious reading in English. So let's start with Samuel. Tell us about Samuel's name and why it matters and how it affects the way we read.
Yeah, so when we're introduced to Samuel, just briefly, we're introduced to this man named Elkanah, and he's got two wives. His first wife, Hannah, is barren and is not able to have children. And his second wife does have children. And so Hannah is just distraught. And they go to the temple to offer their offerings. And Hannah is so distraught looking that Eli, the priest, thinks that she's drunk, right? That she's had too much fun at this festive meal that is a sacrifice. And, she ain't having it anymore. And she's like, no, I'm not drunk. I'm praying. And she tells him what she's praying for. And as we look here in Samuel's story, we're going to see where this verb ask or sha'al comes up so many different times. So you can go ahead and show that slide. So Eli says to Hannah, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. So Eli says that to Hannah right after that. And then she goes home and she gets pregnant and she has a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. In the intervening years, she raises Samuel, and then she brings him, once he is weaned, to the temple to dedicate him at the temple. And she says, for this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore, I've lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. All right. All of these right here in yellow, all of these highlighted words in yellow are the same word ask. And you're just like, what? Oh, what's going on with that? They're not translated as ask. Some of them would be a little redundant, but also, as we think about how the Hebrew word works, the triradical root in Hebrew is the basic root of a word. It's only 3 letters. Radical just means letter in Hebrew. I know it sounds radical to even call it that, but it just means letter. So it's only 3 letters. And so it would be that sha'al sound, sheen, aleph, lamed, if you guys are following along in Hebrew. And whenever it's in the simple form of the verb, it will be ask, right? It means to ask. But then whenever we switch to like what's called the hiphil form of the verb, it's causative. So it means to cause the answer to your asking, basically, which means that you've answered them or lent them something, right? So that's why Samuel's name gets, or right there at the end, she's lent him to the Lord. She's, given him back to the Lord, essentially, because Samuel is what she asked for. And so she's going to answer God with what she asked for, basically. So it's kind of hard to see, but I also put a little red arrow there because we're going to zoom in on that little phrase, that part of the sentence where it's in green. She called his name Samuel, for she said, I've asked for him from the Lord. All right, so that's like a puzzle. It's a little bit of a puzzle. She called his name. His name is God. We've already looked at that. His name is God. And so, because that's what she asked for, this is kind of awkward in Hebrew, because most of the time, whenever we have a naming formula in Hebrew, the name corresponds to what follows. Like, and he will be called Abraham because he will be the father of many nations. Well, it means father of many. Or he will be called Ishmael because God heard me. His name means God heard. Right? So most of the time the name follows the meaning, but you can see here, she called his name Samuel because I've asked for him from the Lord. This does not follow necessarily.
All right. So I have asked for him from the Lord. That's not literally what Shmuel, what this name means. So there's our puzzle. And looking at the Hebrew here might help us figure out what's going on, right?
Yeah, I would say might help us figure out, because there are scholars in the past who have just thought, oh, this is like Saul's birth narrative and Samuel's birth narrative shoved together, because that explanation in quotes, I've asked for him from the Lord, doesn't explain the Samuel. But scholars recently have noted that like it seems very intentional. All of the details that follow are only related to Samuel. So if we just kind of look and think deeper about the Hebrew text, maybe that wordplay, again, is supposed to give us meaning and not just confusion, right? Meaning, but not confusion.
All right, well, let's take a look.
All right, so I've got just verses 21, 27, 28. I left out Eli's comment to Hannah, but there we see his name is Samuel. The name for, or the word for name in Hebrew is shame. And whenever I say his name, it's Shmo. So literally it's Shmo Shmuel there in Hebrew. So you can hear the like alliteration, Shmo Shmuel. His name is Samuel, which means he is God, because from Yahweh I asked him. So that's where we get that first introduction of that root, sha'al, or sheen, aleph, lamed. And you can see all 5 instances there in the slide. And we have some emphasis. So I've highlighted where the emphasis is in the text there in blue. For this boy I prayed. So for this one, like this one child I prayed, and Yahweh gave him to me. And so we're going to see how this boy who came from Yahweh, she's now going to give back to Yahweh. So that's why I've like highlighted all those Yahwehs there. So you can see this kind of interplay here between God and also Hannah, which is why later commentators have thought like this is intentional. This is intentional here with Shaul. So she says, I prayed and Yahweh gave him to me. My asking, which I asked from him, sounds unnecessarily repetitive. If it is unnecessarily repetitive in English, it's unnecessarily repetitive in Hebrew. So it's communicating meaning. And I also have given the one asked for to Yahweh all the days that he lives. He is Saul to Yahweh. He is Saul to Yahweh. So I like highlighted that last little section there in red. And that's where like little puzzle begins to get solved. But normally that's translated, he is lent to Yahweh. So all the days that he lives, all the days of his life, he is lent to Yahweh. All right, so this is the first Saul in the story. So that little puzzle of like, why does the naming formula not match the name is answered at the end. Normally, whenever we're introducing, or often, I'll say often, whenever we're introducing the name of a character, we'll say he is Abraham because he is the father of many, right? He is this. So now we have he is Saul to Yahweh. So he is the one who is asked for from Yahweh and is given to Yahweh. So this is the true Saul. It almost functions as a second naming formula for Samuel. So that's why it makes sense once you look at the entire context.
Which brings us to Saul. Again, like why is the text setting up these patterns of names and repeated words, right? Well, when we get to Saul's story and Saul's introduction, we see what the text is doing, and we see how we're supposed to interpret this. So, are we ready to talk about Saul?
Yeah, like just a quick introduction. What we're going to see is Saul is the one who's also going to be asked for. So we're going to pull together these two Sauls out of the story. The first Saul, his name is Samuel, and the second Saul is going to be the king of Israel. And so we are meant as readers to draw comparisons between the two and to think deeply about why they're both included in this text and talked about in this way with this wordplay. So yeah, let's look at Saul and all the ways that verb ask come up with Saul. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people ask for a king. And this is actually a low point in the history of Israel because God is supposed to be their king and Samuel is supposed to be the spiritual leader of the people of Israel. And so initially, whenever they ask for a king, Samuel is upset because he feels like they have rejected him. But God says to him in chapter 8, verse 7, obey the voice of the people and all they say, because they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And so give them the king that they are asking for. So give them Saul, right? Give them Saul. It's basically that. So you're like, man, how ironic is it that the first king of Israel happens to be named Saul? In 1 Samuel chapter 9, we finally meet this guy who's going to become king. And it has a lot of resonance with how we meet Samuel's father, Elkanah, in chapter 1. So we're meeting Saul's father, Benjamin, just like we met Samuel's father, Elkanah. And we get down to the bottom and we see he had a son whose name was Saul, the one asked for, a handsome young man who stood a head taller than all the rest of the people of Israel, right? So he is like, this is your guy. If you're looking for anybody to be king, he looks like a great candidate. A great, awesome warrior is what you want as a king. And then lastly, after Samuel anoints Saul, he brings all the people of Israel together to show them who their new king is going to be. And they're casting lots for him. And eventually they get down to the son of Kish. And there's no son of Kish to be found. When they sought him, they could not find him. So they asked again of the Lord, is there still a man to come? And the Lord said, behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage. So Saul is hiding whenever they go to look for him as their king. So that's just kind of loosely how it plays out. And it has a little bit more drama there, even in 2 Samuel chapter 12. But I'll leave that a little bit for the readers to go look at too.
So Saul's story of coming to be king, meant to be understood in light of Samuel's, right? Samuel was asked for, And we were talking before this, and uh, Eli calls this or is it Eli or the narrator that calls this a righteous request?
Yeah, I think it's the narrator.
Okay. So, but Hannah's
Yeah.
request for a son is called a
Hannah's request is
righteous.
considered righteous. Mm-hmm.
Yes. But the people's request for a king, the ask for one, this request is called wicked by Samuel, right?
Yes. Yeah. So in 2 Samuel chapter 12, he says, your wicked request for a king, right? So Hannah's request is righteous. The people's request is wicked. And what we're going to see is you kind of get what you ask for, right? We kind of have that phrase even in English, and you get what you ask for. Hannah asked for a son, and she ends up with a son who's a spiritual leader of Israel, who lives all the days of his life in the temple or the tabernacle of Yahweh, in the tent of Yahweh. And then the people ask for Saul, and they get a king who is hiding when they go to look for him. He's hiding from before the Lord, and he's hiding from the people. And even whenever he's supposed to go off the battle, which is what he's supposed to be good for, he's like hiding from Goliath. And, he's always hiding. He's hiding from the people and the Lord. So you get these two people juxtaposed against each other.
Again, reading in English, you can get all the events there, but you miss the way that the author is using the language to compare and to bring these two stories together, to help you see, here's what following Yahweh looks like, right? Here's what following Yahweh doesn't look like. And then we miss that where we're just reading in English. It's good to know, as a good commentary would call your attention to these kinds of things. But, just reading through the text, it's hard to see.
And then we see the king that is God's choice, David. So the people's choice is Saul, but God's choice is David. And where does David want to be? Is he hiding from the Lord? No, he writes Psalm 23, where he says he wants to be in the house of the Lord all the days of his life, just like Samuel was going to be in the house of the Lord all the days of his life, right? Forever. So it's just this beautiful kind of symmetry once you begin like tying in multiple passages throughout the book of Samuel, but even like thinking about Psalm 23 with David, of how these are three different portraits of three different men and how they lead Israel in righteousness or unrighteousness. And we're supposed to think about that as an individual. How do we ask things of God from a right posture? How do we receive things from God in a right posture? But also as a corporate group, Israel, or a corporate group, the church, how might our desires as a church not actually align with what God's desire is for his own people?
Makes a lot of sense. And you kind of see the function and purpose of these narratives as it relates to Israel, trying to grapple with what it means to follow and be faithful to Yahweh.
Yep.
I don't know if we can return to this metaphor of, starting your favorite TV show. What would you say if somebody told you, yeah, I didn't really like that show that you told me to watch? You're like, really? And they're like, yeah, I watched this episode out of season 4 and it was okay, but I didn't really get it. What would you be like? You'd be like, hey, no, like of course you didn't get it. You need to go back and get the context, right? I think a lot of times we read the Bible this way, and we miss a lot of the beauty that's there because we don't see these big structures and these big comparisons and these storylines and character arcs and everything that are really making the text come to life and also showing you what it's good for, showing you its purpose, and its message. Great. Any other things with this that you want to leave us with, Courtney?
Yeah, if you guys are wanting to look a little bit more into this on your own, I would say Gary Rendsburg's book is somewhat written for people who don't know Hebrew. If you know Hebrew, it's even better. But if you don't know Hebrew, he's got the Hebrew there, and then he always has like the English transliteration and really talks about how it works. And there's tons of examples in there of things just like this. If you want to dig into something kind of a little bit deeper like that and see what are some ways that you could look at your same story that you've always read through a slightly different lens that is actually driven from the text, that if you were listening to it out loud, you would hear, Shaul Shmuel, and you would get be in on the joke, right? So that's what we want to be as good Bible readers, is just in on the joke, in on the meaning that the original authors want us to take away from it. And like, Ryan said, it's not some secret meaning. It's just, if you were a native speaker, this would be intuitive to you, just like it is in our TV shows.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thank you, Courtney. Opening up our eyes to what's happening in the Hebrew text and helping us see the Bible through the lens of the original Hebrew. That's great. And thanks for watching us here on Kairos Conversations. We do this. We talk about the Bible, and we show you what passages look like when you're looking at it from that vantage point of Greek in the New Testament, Hebrew for the Old Testament. Of course, as you know, we teach Greek and Hebrew. We that is what we do. We get people to the points where they can read through the text on their own, be able to pick up on these things on their own. I mean, in fact, this very subject talking today, I think, began with a conversation between Courtney and one of her Hebrew students. So that's what we're trying to do. If you've got something you'd like us to talk about, let us know. If you've got questions about learning Greek or Hebrew with us, send us a message. Go to our website. But we will see you next time here on Kairos Conversations. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you.